describe the trans-individuality and these kind of form-based convergences of multiple agencies that sound a lot like Lessing's description of Mitleid or abstraction and empathy by Voinger later, right? And as Mitleid would suggest, the point of aesthetic ascension in the empathetic relationship is always pain. And I wonder if...
Not pleasure.
Yeah, never pleasure. Never. I mean, it may be because that's a German tradition of aesthetics, so it's categorically excluded. But I just wonder, since empathy doesn't seem to arise anywhere, at least in the examples that you give, if there's a structural disadvantage to thinking these problems through empathy, or a historical baggage that comes with it, or yeah.
That's a great question. And I first tried to think about the difference between empathy and sympathy. And conceptually, it's so complicated that I gave up on that. And I decided, though maybe I gave up too early, and I imagine I probably did, but empathy is not the word he uses sympathy. And then also for precisely the reason that you named, which is that Whitman, I'm thinking about sympathy in other people and other modes, but in Whitman, sympathy is, for him, it has to be for, I think, sort of political reasons or motivational reasons. It has to be tied up with, yes, pleasure, unity. I think that you're right on the target there as to what would happen if you brought in a different tradition of thinking about connections or cosmic or aesthetic empathy. It would be different. It wouldn't be, I don't think it would be Whitman. Yeah.
I guess my question has to do with, I'm trying to understand sort of this turn from, to use a different set of terms, from the spiritual and the transcendental to the physical and the material. And so I'm going to sort of paraphrase what I hear, and you can sort of tell me if that seems right to you. And that is, he's interested in the non-human in terms of sympathy, not so much in terms of having sympathy for things and for matter, but for the way in which matter has sympathy for us. And there was that wonderful quote you had about judging not as a judge, but as the sun judges. And so
falling around.
Right, so it's making no discrimination about whether we deserve the sympathy or not, right? It's about this sort of universal kind of consonance among that. And not even judging whether something is a thing or whether it's a human, but it simply is, yes.
How does it resonate with things that you think?
Well, I've been looking, I mean, it's interesting because I'm just trying to write about a phrase in an Italian writer who starts a book by saying human it is to have compassion for the afflicted. But he's very turning away from a judgmental vision of compassion, which would be a Christian vision that tells us whether we're sinners or not, and seems to be inviting us to have universal compassion for everybody.
And maybe I'm over-reading the political aspiration of Whitman's book of poems, but it has to do with the diagnosis of what needs to be done at that time and place. And I think what he thinks is, after Civil War, what needs to be done is calm down on the judge, calm down on the rank ordering, calm down on the moralism. And he was like that even about slavery. He was not an abolitionist. He wanted it to sort of evolve away, right? So I think his judge not as the judge judges, but as the sun falling around a helpless thing, this radically ecumenical acceptance thing is what he thought was needed at that time. Now, I'm not sure all times and all places call for that thing. But I think that's part of what's going on here, because he keeps saying things like, what kind of social glue could reconnect the diverse parts without making all the parts have to be the same? So you can be a Southerner, you can be a Northerner, you can be black, you can be white, you can be, and they don't have to all be the same, but somehow, and that's what I think pushes him to this gravitational model, sympathy, because everybody can.
And I just wondered if what that would look like for anxiety. I mean, you alluded to this with the 6 theses, which I don't know. I'm going to look up that document, and with your comments on the pharmaceutical ads and the TV everywhere, TV on the bus in LA, which is driving crazy on the bus. Can you imagine? So I just wondered what the kind of different flavors of anxiety, if you could tease them out, be it, which you've already done in the first part of the talk, but is it the mood, is it the affect, is it habituated? And a secondary question, in terms of thinking about political action, you kind of registered your resistance to the premise that it would be based on militancy necessarily, or...
Okay, I'll just do a little biography as to how, autobiography, how this thing started. I mean, I'm interested, I was like fascinated with Whitman on sympathy, but I'm in the political science department, and everyone's like, what's the politics of this? You're just doing literary analysis. And then I read the 6 theses on anxiety, and I thought, well, there is some connection there, maybe, yeah. So that's how I started this. So I came to the theme of anxiety rather late, so I have a better, richer understanding of the flavors of sympathy than I do about anxiety. But I've been starting to think about different figures of anxiety. And the one that I think is most, this could be, I'm just starting to think about this. What I think is most apt for us now is this, it's objectless, or it's sourceless and objectless. And it's also, almost always encouraged to be experienced as a psychological problem, or psychological defect that you take, anti-anxiety drugs for. And so we have this huge underground discourse of anxiety, but only one way of coping with it, which is, anti-anxiety medication. And so I thought, so that's the starter. That's the starter.
So the psychologizing comes in a way from the opposite direction.
Exactly.
Not,
It's like it's a psychologizing that's politically, or let's say corporately or whatever. It's not. It's not coming from psychologists, although they get Polish politics. Yeah, so there's that. So I have to think more about that real set of relays between pharmaceutical companies, TVs on, securitization, and then if there's a historically specific mode of anxiety that we're coping with today. The other thing I've actually thought about a little bit in terms of like characteristic, I don't know if you call them pathologies or that go with your time and place. I mean, I've also thought a little bit about hoarding. Hoarding and anxiety, hoarding because we live in a society where there's so much crap being generated. You buy all this stuff piling up, it's a hyper-consumer society, so it's not really that much of a surprise that hoarding would be a psychological dysfunction of our time. So then the other question, way much harder. So what do we do? I mean, because 6 theses on anxiety and one solution for how to overcome it. I'm reading the thing carefully. There's no solution. I mean, their solution in there was step number 1 is publicize the political sources of what's experienced or what you're taught to experience as a private thing. So they actually go. That's why I put up our bodies ourselves. And they actually call for consciousness, return to consciousness raising groups, here, there, and everywhere. Every town should have them. When you go in and you say, I'm feeling anxiety, instead of having it in a psychologized way, say, what are the social courses like? What debt? How can you cope with debt? What are the structural sources of everyone being in debt for college tuition, whatever, so sort of to politicize. So that's really their solution for, and I'm with that. Yeah, but I don't know that that's enough. But I think identifying anxiety as a political problem isn't good. Yeah.
Kierkegaard says that anxiety is that moment where we uncover what we have not yet thought of and need to think of. But you dropped Marcuse at the beginning, and I was thinking about the Frankfurt School and its relentless negativity, right? We need to discover our left. We overcome our left melancholy by this relentless negativity, right? And so you've turned to Whitman as a way to kind of recoup affirmation.
Yes.
So, I mean, the Frankfurt School was talking about cultural production, about art, and I'm wondering what that has to say this return to affirmation about the kind of political situation you're describing at the beginning, with this modern culture of anxiety. I mean, the university runs by anxiety as well. Anxiety as this sort of economic, cultural machine. So I'm sort of thinking about the political potential of Marcuse, the Frankfurt School, at this relentless negativity, and then how does this affirmative take that on or take that up, or is it the same thing? Is sympathy just another kind of ethics that's material?
When you're talking, I see there's a possible tension in this consciousness raising thing, which is a kind of demystification, right? Which is like a negativity critique, right? So there's got to be, maybe that's helpful for me to go beyond the 6 theses people, which sort of set my
Because you start with false consciousness, right? They have this false consciousness.
Right, and then you undo it. I do not think that demystification, I think there's limits to the political potency of demystification. And I thought a little bit about like forms of political enchantment, the political, not political enchantment, that enchantment with material experience can actually help energize the will to engage in. So it's an affirmation that might then give you the energy to keep going to those boring meetings where you challenge things, because political activism is exhausting and demoralizing. So yes, I think Whitman shares my view of there's political power to enchantment and affirmation. It doesn't have to be a false consciousness kind of enchantment. It could be enchantment with the press of my foot to the ground springs 100 affections. It could be an enchantment with the creativity made possible by your, making a PowerPoint presentation. I mean, it can be that politics requires affirmation as well as demystification. But I like your question because it will help me to think about, like, what do you do? I mean, it can't just be consciousness raising, because that's, thanks.
Thank you.
The way you're characterizing anxiety is something we have to get away from, is an inheritance of ego psychology. And it ignores a whole other strand of psychoanalysis that emphasizes anxiety as the primary emotion, as the key, that puts you in, it makes you aware that you're in a situation of fundamental existential importance to you.
So it's not bad.
No, it's in traditional Freudian psychoanalysis, when you get away from anxiety in the analytic situation, then you're off track. You have to find a place where you can sustain it, because it's the key that you're in the presence of what's important to you.
But the solution is regression. So the solution is finding a practical solution to the anxiety.
Depending on which solution you're looking at, if you want to look at other forms such as repressed conflict, that you have to be aware that you're encountering conflicts in your life and you're not ever going to get over them, but anxiety reveals that you're in the presence of these situations.
I wonder if that's a different anxiety. I mean that anxiety, is that the same?
Existential anxiety.
Yeah, is that the same kind of anxiety you feel when you think that they're terrorists and ISIS?
I don't think so. I think that's more like fear and paranoia.
Fear and paranoia, maybe not even rightly called anxiety.
Right. Yeah.
What is
Well, there's another anxiety that the genetic anxiety that they're born with when we're in a dangerous situation called psychoanalytic signal anxiety, that Charles Rycroft and others distinguish from existential anxiety.
I don't know if this is interesting. So what's the tradition of psychoanalysis called that would speak to this anxiety that way?
I don't know if it's a particular tradition, but it's the non-ego psychology tradition. The object relations people are especially good with this.
Yeah,
Winnicott, Klein,
Michael Eigen is someone in New York who's extremely good at this. Walter Davis.
But even then, in that situation, isn't anxiety still kind of a surface emotion that signals in the presence of something deeper, a deeper issue?
No, it's the primary emotion that's associated with those deeper conflicts. And so that makes me worry a little bit that sympathy as the solution is something that the capitalist philanthropist can feel good about and work with, because this anxiety is something we've got to get rid of and I can do that through acts of sympathy.
This is not a story about how to vanquish anxiety.
Yeah, at the very end, you
Yeah.
came back to that. How
It's
we
not
need to.
that. It's a story about how something could be done with this maybe genetic energy that he's calling gravitational cosmic, but maybe you call it genetic energy. Something could be done with that that's more productive.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's what I was thinking. Okay.
I guess it seems like what he's doing is sort of bringing people and nature to the same level in order to bring out the importance of the value of what would traditionally have been thought as a Christian hierarchy, and
Right.
he's sort of bringing out the
Great
importance.
chain of being.
Right, yeah,
Yeah.
the chain of being, which is really old school compared to what we think of today. But it's like he's trying to get rid of that idea to show that there's an essential value. You know, matter speaks to matter, like what you were saying, as sort of a human rights activism promotional tool.
Yes.
So are you saying that that's something that's been lost in kind of the daily grind, or being overshadowed, and that's something we
Today?
need to return to? Yeah,
Today,
yeah.
I think that sympathy has fallen into, it's got a bad reputation. And there's some value in it that we might have the sort of, on pain of being called Pollyanna-ish, there might be something to renovate out of the discourse of and the experience of sympathy. And so that's one thing, and I'm using Whitman to try to find a vocabulary, find a story that might, and might sort of show that it doesn't have to be mawkish sentimentality, but it might have to do with, and this is another thing I believe, which might be false, but that there's these undercurrents of connection between people, places, and things that are at work in us at some level. Call it cosmic, I don't know what you want to call it. Call it just gravitational, call it just vibrant matter that relates to other matter, or like, you know, something. And that of course, that doesn't have the final say, because people kill each other, there's all this violence, there's all sorts of bad things happening. It's not, but also, why not acknowledge that there might be something like that at work that you could tap into and maybe ride the wave of a little bit more. First step to riding the wave is have a discourse about it. Let's have a political discourse of sympathy. We got a political discourse of terror. We got a political discourse of fear. We got this. Let's have political discourse in which sympathy can play a role. So that's the big thing.
Okay.
Not really the scholarly project. That's more of a, I don't know, ethical aspiration.
Good.
Yeah.
So would that kind of suggest that maybe, like he's saying, it's almost like a bastardization of nature to say that we've walked away from that and need to return to that. You know, people, like you look at murderers and there's these dead fetuses of sympathy and that. So but yet that's supposed to be part of what we are. So you're sort of suggesting as well that we integrate that as sort of a natural part of the political process.
Oh yeah, that's helpful.
I really love this whole discussion, so thank you. You said one thing in your presentation about how sympathy is a reality independent of people, and I'm not sure if there's a clear sort of answer here, but I was wondering, is it also, you think, independent of like language and the linguistic foundations from which, you know, we can understand or perceive the information that's in front of us, or?
It's very helpful to have language, but I don't think it's reducible to its linguistic expression. I think that's why I like this idea that it's almost like a physical force. What if we thought of sympathy as like a physical force? And of course you don't really know much about it unless you name it, and then you try to study the laws of gravity and, you know, whatever. But yeah, I don't think it's, I mean, you could give you could do this whole presentation, do this whole thing on Whitman, and then say it was an example of the literary technique of personifying, it's a trope. Sympathy is a trope. But I'm saying no. I mean that's one way to think about it. But I do not think it's reducible to language.
Do you think that's why it seems kind of positive or alchemical in terms of like what we can do with what we have? Like here's, you know, I love what you said about enchantment not just being a sort of false consciousness, but almost remind me of like the sympathy again in terms of attraction and what we want to build, not just tear down.
Yes, exactly. That's what you're thinking like, yeah.
There is sort of a gaping hole in sort of Newton's sort of conception of gravity, in the sense, and specifically in relation to how you were talking about sympathy, that he never basically offered a mechanism for how gravity works, and he was essentially always accused of essentially talking about occult forces materially because gravity works at a distance. But part of the context in the 19th century is, as there's a sort of a synthesis of electricity and magnetism, there's this concern about how you also then could come up with a mechanistic sort of description of how gravity works, that then sort of leads to people talking about sympathetic vibrations through the ether, et cetera, et cetera. I think that that's part of what you're talking about.
Yes.
But there is, as I said, there's not yet an explanation, mechanical explanation for it.
Right.
But yet, and that then underlies this whole part of the whole discussion about vitalism and mechanism in the 19th century. So that's obviously exactly what you're talking about.
Exactly. I mean, but I like what you say, which is to sort of bring in the history of science context of Whitman's work, which is that gravity, I didn't think of that before, that gravity would be perfect for him because it's got this, it's not reducible in their understanding to mechanistic explanation, so it's got this openness, this open hole in the center for it, where he can shove in the kind of force he wants to make called sympathy.
And the very language that they're referring to, they're using is actually about sympathetic vibrations.
Right, yeah, that's
because
great.
it's about the interconnection between material, essentially material entities, and the fact that it's not supposed to work through empty space, but yet somehow gravity apparently does.
Right. Yeah, I am very interested in vitalism, and yeah, okay, thank you.
As I understood your sort of representation of it, these dominant affects, misery, boredom, and then anxiety, are a depoliticizing strategy, right? From specifically of capital or capitalism to essentially ontologize what are actually contingent historical conditions. So my question there would be whether, again, without knowing this particular manifesto, whether we lose something by tying that to sympathy in the sense that sort of we're all sort of in the same boat or something, because it also seems like in pointing to anxiety as a depoliticizing sort of affect that's put on top of a situation, that erases boundaries that actually need to be maintained, right? Because there's, there is a kind of oppression going on there that's not diffuse. It's precisely anxiety that's sort of the illusion or the false consciousness that sees it as sort of diffuse, people killing people in the world for who knows why, right? And I guess I'd be curious to hear what your thoughts are on whether one can leverage sort of gaps between these in interesting ways, because it seems like, I mean, you sort of drew really nicely, like there seems to be a fundamental figure of harmony or attraction between them, the way you described it. I mean, the five ways are clearly linked, but they also seem to work under different sort of master figures or tropes. One would be resonance early on, right, where when the air is vibrating, the string, the same harmony will vibrate. Another one would be reflection, though, with the flesh and the flesh. Right? And those would seem to be two distinct patterns.
Yeah.
And I mean, with the reflection, I can't, I like the way you move it away from a sort of sympathy as narcissism. But I can't help but think of the scene in Hoffman's The Sandman, where the protagonist is holding the hand of his beloved, who happens to be a puppet.
Right.
And his hand warms her cold wooden hand, and he feels the warmth pulsing back to him. And feels that she must be sort of the most sympathetic human person he's met. And then there's also sympathy as just gravitational attraction. So I wonder if there's a way to sort of leverage those tropes to open up the question of sympathy a little bit. And I mean,
I love that. That's great. Let me just kind of maybe go back to start to the first one. And the misgiving that you name is a real misgiving. And what you've just said, when you know it's important, like it's like the harms are not diffuse, and so maybe we need the, you know, you need the, basically what you've given is a neo-Marxist, you've named the value of the neo-Marxist style analysis, which I go with, right? But there's also, that doesn't do everything, there are blind spots to it, and maybe sympathy isn't the answer, but I'm trying to find a way to address what that analysis, which I don't want to get rid of, can't do. And I think that the focus for me, I don't know if you've read Jody Dean's book, The Communist Horizon. Yeah, that's like an extreme version, a bad version of what he's got. And I just think politically it doesn't have much purchase in the U.S., right? So I'm trying to think about what are the weaknesses of that kind of analysis, but I don't want to disparage the value of that kind of analysis. Okay, that's point one. Point two is, on that, is maybe misery, boredom, and anxiety are not the ones that are really been circulating, those three waves of capitalism, but those do seem to be the ones that the critics have latched onto. I mean, when you think about it, you know, strikes and waves, that is with misery. And I do think that the new left was all about fighting boredom, but boredom isn't our problem. I mean, it's not our problem, but I think that's it, just to frame the resistance techniques in terms of a sort of slightly outdated affective analysis. I think there's something to that. You know, that I just keep thinking about the slogan of sex, drugs, rock and roll, and use art in enlightenment. I mean, I wonder whether that's really there. So anyway, I hear what you're saying, which is that there's a tension between both affirming the Marx, let's for shorthand call it the neo-Marxist analysis, the value of that. You don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but maybe you want to come up with, enrich the panoply of, in your toolbox of resistance, techniques of resistance. Okay, then the second thing you said, I just have to take what you say, because it sounds like you're better on that than me about the tropes and as you say, leveraging the differences between the way these different, rather, because I have tended to sort of put them under the big umbrella of sympathy or resonance. Yeah. But there's probably good differences that I could think through and do more with.
Because if there is this kind of reflection, right, then
yeah, maybe that
at instances it is open to the charge of solipsism or narcissism or something like that. Right? Yeah. Especially pertaining to subjects and subjects, objects and objects.
Yes, really helpful.
Well, that might be just the right moment for us to thank you once again for really fabulous.